Sometimes, when life takes everything from you, all you can do is start over with nothing. Julian Graves knew that feeling all too well. At 45, he'd lost his business and his son, and he was desperate for a fresh start. So he bought a rundown farm in Iowa for just $1. He wanted peace, solitude, a place to heal. But when he came back from town, he found women working in his fields, harvesting wheat like the land was theirs. They weren't strangers. They were single mothers, widows, women who'd been welcomed here by the man who owned the farm before Julian. They'd built a life on this soil. Now Julian had to decide, send them away or stay and become part of something bigger than himself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Julian Graves had always believed that a man's worth could be measured by what he built with his own 2 hands. For 20 years, he'd run a custom carpentry business in Des Moines. Nothing fancy, just honest work creating furniture, cabinets, and home renovations for families who appreciated craftsmanship. He'd employed 6 men at the peak, good workers with families of their own. The shop had smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and Julian had known every plank of wood by its grain, every tool by its weight in his palm. Then the economy shifted. Big box stores undercut his prices. Clients wanted faster, cheaper, mass-produced. One by one, his contracts dried up. He mortgaged his house to keep the shop open, then mortgaged it again. When the bank finally foreclosed, he lost everything in a single afternoon. The business, the house, and worst of all, his marriage. Sharon had stood in the kitchen of their rental apartment, arms crossed, her voice flat with exhaustion. "I can't do this anymore, Julian. Wyatt needs stability. He needs a home, not a father who's drowning." Julian had tried to argue, tried to promise things would get better, but the truth sat heavy between them. He was 45 years old, broke, and sleeping on an air mattress in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of mildew. The custody hearing had lasted less than an hour. The judge had looked at Julian's bank statements, his lack of steady employment, and awarded primary custody to Sharon. Wyatt, 14 and already distant, had barely met his father's eyes. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of working day labor, of phone calls that went to voicemail, of waking at 3 in the morning with his chest tight and his future a blank wall. 6 months of wondering if this was all there was. A slow fade into irrelevance, a cautionary tale about pride and poor timing. Then he'd seen the flyer at the unemployment office. County Revitalization Program. Abandoned farms available for $1 to qualified applicants willing to restore and maintain the property. It seemed absurd, possibly a scam, but Julian had nothing left to lose. He'd filled out the application in careful block letters, listing his carpentry skills and his willingness to relocate. 3 weeks later, he'd received a call. The farm was 80 acres in rural Iowa, 2 hours from anywhere that mattered. The county representative had been apologetic but honest. "Mr. Graves, I'll be straight with you. The property's been abandoned for 8 months since the owner passed. House is barely standing, barn's got a collapsed roof, and most of the fields have gone to weeds. But the land's good, and if you can make something of it, it's yours for $1 and a promise to maintain it for 5 years. Julian had driven out on a grey April morning. The farmhouse sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. The barn leaned to one side like an old man catching his breath. But the land rolled away in gentle swells, and even through the weeds and neglect, Julian could see the bones of something beautiful. Oak trees older than the state itself stood sentinel along the property line. A creek wound through the back 40, clear water over smooth stones. He'd signed the papers that afternoon. For the first 2 weeks, Julian lived in his truck, then in a tent pitched in the front yard once the weather warmed. He spent his days clearing brush, patching the roof, replacing rotten boards on the porch. The work was hard and the progress slow, but it felt honest. No one was depending on him. No one was disappointed when he fell short. Just him, the land, and the quiet. The nearby town of Ferndale was a single main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a church. Population 1,200, according to the faded sign at the town limits. The locals eyed Julian with polite suspicion when he came in for supplies. He was an outsider, a city man trying his hand at something he clearly didn't understand. At the hardware store, an older man with weathered hands had looked at Julian's purchase, fence posts, wire nails, and said, "You're the fellow took over the Thornton place." "That's right," Julian had replied. Good man Thornton was. Shame what happened. Julian had wanted to ask what happened, but the man had already turned away, and Julian had learned that small towns gave up their stories slowly, if at all. One evening, working late to shore up the barn's foundation, Julian had climbed into the farmhouse attic looking for extra lumber. Instead, he'd found boxes of old paperwork, photographs, and a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. He'd brought it down to his camping lantern and opened to the first page. The handwriting was steady, old-fashioned. March 3rd, 1998. Bought this farm today. Annette says I'm crazy, but I've spent 40 years working for other men. Time I worked for myself. Julian had read late into the night. The journal spanned decades, entries about planting and harvest, about struggles and small victories, about Annette's death from cancer in 2007, about children who'd moved to the coasts and rarely called. But then, around 2015, the tone shifted. June 12, 2015, met a woman at the church food bank today, Beatrice. Her husband died in a combine accident last year. Bank took her farm. She's living in her car. I told her she could use the back field to grow vegetables if she needed. She cried, "I haven't felt useful in a long time." More entries followed. More names. More stories of women who'd found their way to the farm, who'd planted and harvested and built something together. Thornton's loneliness had transformed into purpose. The final entry was dated 8 months ago. "I'm tired. Doctor says my heart's giving out. I never made things right with my kids. That's my great regret. But I think I made things right here. This land has fed people. That counts for something." Julian had closed the journal with a strange ache in his chest. He understood that loneliness, that hunger for purpose. He'd come here wanting to disappear, but Thornton's words suggested another possibility, that isolation wasn't the same as peace, that building something alone wasn't nearly as meaningful as building something together. Still, Julian kept to himself. He worked the land, repaired the fences, and slowly coaxed the farmhouse back toward livable. He discovered that some of the fields had been maintained. The wheat in the southern 40 acres was growing tall and golden, obviously planted and tended by someone. He'd assumed the county had contracted it out, or perhaps neighboring farmers had used the empty land. On a Thursday morning in late June, Julian drove into town for supplies. He needed PVC pipe for the irrigation system, more lumber for the porch steps, and a new blade for his circular saw. The hardware store was low on stock, so he made the longer drive to a farm supply center in the next county. By the time he loaded everything and drove back, it was late afternoon of the third day. He turned onto his property and immediately noticed vehicles parked near the barn. A faded blue pickup, a minivan with a cracked windshield, an old sedan held together by rust and prayer. His first thought was trespassers, maybe thieves. His second thought was that he should have locked the barn. Julian parked and climbed out slowly. He could hear voices from the wheat field, and when he walked toward them, shading his eyes against the low sun, he saw figures moving through the golden stalks. 5 women, working in a line with scythes and gathering baskets, their movements practiced and efficient. He stood there, confusion giving way to a slow anger. This was his land, his one chance to rebuild, and these strangers were harvesting his crop like they owned it. Julian walked into the field, his boots crushing the stubble. "Hey, what are you doing?" The women stopped. The nearest one, a woman in her late 50s with grey hair pulled back in a bun and a face weathered by sun and work, straightened and met his gaze calmly. "Harvesting wheat," she said simply. "Same as we do every year." Julian stared at the woman, trying to process her words. Same as every year. As if that explained anything. As if her presence here, on his land, harvesting his wheat, was the most natural thing in the world. "This is my property," he said, keeping his voice level. I bought it through the county program. I have the deed. The woman nodded, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. I know, we heard someone had taken over. We were hoping to finish the harvest before you came back. Hoping to finish, Julian stopped, shook his head. You can't just come onto someone's land and take their crops. We're not taking, another voice said. A younger woman, maybe 30, stepped forward. She had dark hair in a braid and carried a toddler on her hip. We planted this wheat. We've been maintaining these fields for 3 years. Julian looked from one woman to the next. An elderly woman with kind eyes and gnarled hands. A woman around 40 with a teacher's posture and wire-rimmed glasses. A girl who couldn't be more than 22, thin and pale, holding a hand-woven basket. And the first woman, the one who'd spoken with such calm certainty. I don't understand, Julian said finally. Who are you? The older woman set down her scythe and walked toward him, extending her hand. I'm Beatrice Walsh. This is Valeria Reeves, June Hartwell, Faye Morrison and Iris Chen. She gestured to each woman in turn. We've been farming this land with Mr. Thornton's permission since he opened it to us. Some of us for 7 years, others more recently. Julian didn't take her hand. Mr. Thornton is dead. The land belongs to the county, and now it belongs to me. We know, Beatrice said quietly, lowering her hand. We attended his funeral. He was a good man. The toddler on Valeria's hip began to fuss, and she bounced him gently, her expression guarded. Mr. Thornton let us use the land to grow food. We're not squatters or thieves. We work hard, we maintain the fields, and we share what we harvest. June, the elderly woman, spoke in a soft voice that carried surprising strength. My husband died of cancer 5 years ago. The medical bills took everything. I lost my home. I was living in my daughter's basement, trying not to be a burden, when someone at church told me about this place. Mr. Thornton said I could plant a garden here, grow vegetables for myself. He said the land was meant to feed people. Faye, the teacher, adjusted her glasses. I left my husband 3 years ago. He was violent. I took my daughter and nothing else. I teach at the elementary school in Ferndale, but teacher's salary doesn't go far. Mr. Thornton let me use a 1/4 acre to grow food to supplement what I could afford. It meant my daughter didn't go to bed hungry. The youngest woman, Iris, spoke barely above a whisper. My husband died overseas, military. I had nowhere to go after. No family, no money. I've been living in a camper on the back of the property. Mr. Thornton said it was fine. He said I could stay as long as I needed. Julian felt something shift in his chest, an uncomfortable pressure. These weren't faceless trespassers. They were people with stories, with losses that echoed his own. But this was his land, his one chance to start over. I'm sorry for your situations, he said carefully. I am, but that doesn't give you the right to be here. The program requires that I maintain the property. I can't do that if we've been maintaining it, Valeria interrupted, her voice sharp. Look around. These fields didn't plant themselves. The irrigation system didn't fix itself. We've put in hundreds of hours, our own money for seeds and equipment. This wheat, we earned it. You earned it on my land, Julian said, his voice rising despite himself. I didn't ask you to plant it. I didn't agree to any of this. Beatrice held up a hand, a gesture of peace. You're right. We should have contacted you as soon as we knew the property had transferred. That's our fault. But Mr. Thornton made us a promise. He said this land would always be a place for people who needed it. We believed him. He didn't own it anymore when he died, Julian said. Promises don't transfer with deeds. The women stood silent, and Julian could see the understanding settling over them, the realization that their sanctuary, their lifeline, was at the mercy of a stranger who owed them nothing. Valeria shifted the toddler to her other hip. How long do we have? What? To harvest and clear out? How long are you giving us? Julian looked at the wheat surrounding them, golden and ready. At the tools laid carefully in the rows, the baskets already half filled. At the faces of these women who'd built something here out of necessity and hope. I need to think, he said. We can finish by the end of the week, Beatrice said. The wheat's ready now. If we wait much longer, we'll lose it to weather or pests. Let us finish the harvest. Then we'll talk. Julian wanted to say no, wanted to assert his ownership, his right to make decisions about his own property. But something in Beatrice's steady gaze, in June's worn hands, in Iris's fearful eyes, stopped him. "You have until Sunday," he said. "Finish the harvest, then we talk." Valeria's toddler began to cry in earnest, and she turned away, bouncing him and murmuring. June picked up her scythe with a small nod of gratitude. Faye and Iris exchanged glances, relief and uncertainty mixed in equal measure. Beatrice stepped closer to Julian. "Thank you. I know this isn't what you expected, but I promise you we're not trying to take anything from you. We just need a chance." "Sunday," Julian repeated, and walked back toward the farmhouse. He spent the evening on the porch, watching the women work until the light faded. They moved with quiet efficiency, talking among themselves in voices too low to hear. When darkness finally forced them to stop, they loaded their tools into the vehicles and drove away, headlights cutting through the Iowa night. Julian sat alone, the journal in his lap. He opened it to a random page and read, "Beatrice brought her grandchildren today. Watching them run through the rows of corn, I remembered what it was like when my own kids were small. Before I got too busy, too focused on work. I can't get those years back, but maybe I can do better now. Maybe I can be the kind of man who makes room for people instead of pushing them away." Julian closed the journal and looked out at the dark fields. He'd come here to be alone, to avoid the complications of other people's needs and expectations. He'd wanted simplicity, control, a life he could manage on his own terms. Instead, he'd inherited a community he never asked for and a choice he didn't want to make. He thought about Wyatt, about the custody hearing, about the judge's assessment that Julian couldn't provide stability. What would it mean to evict these women? What kind of man did that make him? But what would it mean to let them stay? To give up his solitude, his plan, his one chance at a fresh start? Julian sat on the porch until well past midnight, the question turning in his mind like a wheel, with no clear stopping point. In the distance, an owl called. The wind moved through the wheat with a sound like whispered conversations. By the time he finally went inside, he still had no answer. Julian didn't sleep. He lay in his sleeping bag on the floor of what would eventually be a bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Beatrice's weathered face, June's grateful nod, Iris's fear. He saw Valeria's toddler fussing on her hip, and he thought about Wyatt at that age, chubby hands reaching for everything, voice full of questions Julian had always promised to answer later. Later had turned into never. At dawn, he gave up on sleep and made coffee on his camping stove. He was sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun paint the fields gold, when he heard a vehicle approaching. The blue pickup from yesterday rattled up the drive and parked near the barn. Beatrice climbed out, carrying a thermos and a cloth-wrapped bundle. She walked toward him with the same calm confidence she'd shown in the wheat field. "Morning. Thought you might appreciate some real coffee and breakfast. I'm guessing your camping setup doesn't run to fresh biscuits." Julian wanted to be irritated by her presumption, but the smell of the biscuits made his stomach clench with hunger. He'd been living on canned soup and granola bars for weeks. "I can't be bought with baked goods," he said. Beatrice smiled, a small curve of her mouth that suggested she'd heard worse. "Not trying to buy you. Just trying to be neighborly." She sat down on the step beside him, uninvited, and unwrapped the cloth. 6 golden biscuits, still warm. She poured coffee from her thermos into the cup he was holding, and then into the lid for herself. They sat in silence for a moment, eating. The biscuits were perfect, flaky, buttery, with just a hint of honey. Julian hadn't tasted anything this good in months. "I'm not leaving," Beatrice said finally. "Just so you know. None of us are. Not without a fight." Julian swallowed his bite of biscuit. "I could call the sheriff." "Have you all removed for trespassing?" "You could," she agreed. "But you won't. Why are you so sure?" Beatrice looked out at the fields, her eyes distant. "Because I've been doing this long enough to recognize a man who's lost something. You came here looking for the same thing we all did, a place to rebuild. You just didn't expect to find it already occupied." Julian said nothing, which Beatrice seemed to take as permission to continue. My husband Carl died 11 years ago. Combine accident during harvest. One minute he was waving at me from the cab, the next, she stopped, took a sip of coffee. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations. But we'd mortgaged it twice to buy new equipment, and when Carl died, I couldn't keep up with the payments alone. Bank foreclosed within 6 months. I'm sorry, Julian said, and meant it. My kids moved away years before. Good jobs in Chicago and Denver. They offered to let me come stay with them, take turns, but I didn't want to be a burden shuffled between households. I tried to make it on my own, worked at the diner, cleaned houses, but it wasn't enough. I was sleeping in my truck when someone at church told me about Mr. Thornton. She turned to look at Julian directly. He saved my life, not in some dramatic way, but in the way that matters. He gave me purpose back. He let me work this land, grow food, be useful again. And when other women came, women running from bad marriages, women who'd lost everything to medical bills or bad luck, he made room for them too. That was his choice to make, Julian said. It's not mine, isn't it? Beatrice asked. You own this land now. What are you going to do with it? Farm it alone? You know anything about wheat farming? Julian had to admit he didn't. We do, Beatrice said. We've learned. We know the soil, the weather patterns, when to plant and when to harvest. We've built something here, not just crops, community. That's worth something. It's not worth my future, Julian said quietly. The county program requires me to maintain this property for 5 years. If I can't do that, I lose it. I need to figure out how to make this work, and I can't do that with us in the way, Beatrice finished. She nodded slowly. I understand. But what if we're not in the way? What if we could help? Before Julian could respond, she stood, collecting the cloth and thermos. Think about it. We'll be back this afternoon to finish the harvest. You're welcome to join us if you want to see what we actually do here. She walked back to her truck, and Julian watched her drive away, feeling oddly off balance. He'd expected anger or pleading, not this quiet, steady reasoning, not an invitation. He spent the morning walking the property with new eyes, seeing what he'd missed before. The irrigation system wasn't just functional, it was well maintained, with recent repairs evident in the newer sections of pipe. The tool shed was organized, equipment cleaned and oiled. Someone had reinforced the barn's remaining good wall with proper bracing. In the back 40 acres, he found the camper Iris had mentioned. It was ancient, a small trailer that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind, but someone had set up a neat camp around it. A folding chair, a wash basin, a line strung between trees for drying clothes. Through the small window he could see a crib. Julian stood there for a long moment, imagining what it must be like for a young widow to live in a camper with an infant, no family, no safety net. He thought about the choice he was facing and what it would mean to take away even this small refuge. When he returned to the farmhouse, he found Thornton's journal and read more entries. The old man's voice came through clearly, gruff but kind, lonely but purposeful. One entry stopped him. July 19th, 2018, my son called today. First time in 2 years. Wanted money, not conversation. I gave it to him anyway. After he hung up, I sat here feeling sorry for myself until Beatrice showed up with a basket of tomatoes and a story about how June's arthritis is getting better from all the work in the garden. She thanked me for giving them this space. I realized something. I failed my own children, pushed them away with my stubbornness and pride. But maybe I can do better by these women. Maybe it's not too late to be the kind of man who makes room instead of walls. Julian closed the journal as the vehicles returned that afternoon. The 5 women emerged and headed to the fields, and Julian found himself following. He didn't announce himself, just picked up a scythe from the pile of tools and joined the line. Valeria glanced at him surprised. You know how to use that? I can figure it out, Julian said. She showed him the proper angle, the rhythm of the swing. Let the blade do the work. Don't force it. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the swish of the scythes and the occasional murmured instruction. Julian's shoulders ached within an hour, muscles protesting work they weren't accustomed to. But there was something satisfying about it, the The clean cut, the gathered stalks, the visible progress. During a water break, June approached him with a jar of cold tea. "You're doing well for a beginner." "Thanks," Julian said, accepting the jar gratefully. "Mr. Thornton didn't know anything about farming when he started either," she said. But he learned. He wasn't too proud to ask for help. It was a gentle observation, not quite a criticism. Julian drank the tea and looked at the women resting in the shade of an oak tree. Valeria's children, he could see them now, playing near the barn, chased each other in circles. Iris sat apart, nursing her baby under a light blanket. "What happened to your husband?" Julian asked June. Beatrice mentioned medical bills. June's face softened with old grief. "Pancreatic cancer. He fought for 18 months. We tried everything, surgery, chemotherapy, experimental treatments. None of it worked, and all of it cost more than we could ever afford. When he finally passed, I had nothing left but debt and memories." "I'm sorry," Julian said. "Life takes things from us," June said simply. "Sometimes all at once, sometimes slowly. The question is what we do after. Do we close ourselves off, or do we find ways to keep going?" She stood and returned to work, leaving Julian with the question hanging in the warm afternoon air. By sunset, they'd harvested half the wheat field. The women loaded their tools and prepared to leave, and Beatrice approached Julian one more time. "Tomorrow's Saturday," she said. "We'll finish up. Sunday we can talk about what comes next." Julian nodded, too tired to argue. As he watched them drive away, he realized something had shifted. He still didn't know what he was going to do, but he was beginning to understand what he'd walked into, not just a piece of land, but a web of lives and needs and histories more complicated than any deed could capture. That night, he read more of Thornton's journal by lantern light, and when he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of wheat fields that stretched to the horizon, golden and endless, and full of voices he was only beginning to hear. The weekend passed in a blur of work. Saturday brought clouds and the threat of rain, which sent everyone into urgent motion. They harvested through the day, stopping only for water and brief rests. Julian worked alongside them, learning the rhythm of the scythe, the proper way to bundle the stalks, the care required to separate grain from chaff. Valeria's children, a girl of 9 named Sophia and a boy of 6 named Luis, helped in small ways, gathering scattered stalks and bringing water to the workers. Julian watched them play during breaks, their laughter bright against the grey sky, and felt the familiar ache of missing Wyatt. On Sunday morning, the last of the wheat came in. The women worked with quiet satisfaction, and when the final bundle was tied, Beatrice surveyed the field with her hands on her hips. "Good harvest," she said. "Best in 3 years." They gathered in the shade of the barn to rest, and Julian brought out jugs of water he'd filled from the well. The women accepted them with tired smiles, and for a moment no one spoke about the future or the decision that still hung between them. Faye broke the silence. "I should tell you my story, since everyone else has." Julian looked at her, the teacher with wire-rimmed glasses and careful posture. She'd been quiet all weekend, working steadily but speaking little. "You don't have to," he said. "I want to." She removed her glasses and cleaned them on her shirt, a gesture that seemed more about buying time than necessity. "I was married for 12 years. My husband was charming when we dated, controlling after we married. It got worse slowly. Little things at first, then bigger things. By the time I realized what was happening, I felt trapped." She put her glasses back on and met Julian's gaze steadily. "He never hit me where anyone could see. He controlled our money, isolated me from friends, told me I was worthless without him. My daughter Penelope, she was 7 when I finally left. I took her in the middle of the night with 2 suitcases and nothing else." Julian felt his chest tighten. "Where is she now?" "With my mother in Ferndale, just for the summer. She's 10 now, doing well in school." Faye's voice softened. "But leaving meant starting over with nothing. Teacher's salary is decent, but not enough for rent, utilities, food, and everything else. I was shopping at the food bank when Beatrice told me about this place." She gestured at the fields around them. "Mr. Thornton let me use a 1/4 acre. I grew vegetables, learned to can and preserve. It meant Penelope had good food, and it meant I didn't have to choose between feeding her and paying the electric bill. That matters more than you might think, June added. Faye's taught all of us how to can properly. Last winter we traded preserved vegetables with half the county. People knew they were getting quality because Faye doesn't cut corners. Julian looked around at the women, seeing them not as obstacles, but as individuals who'd built something resilient out of shared necessity. They'd created a support system, an economy of mutual aid that extended beyond these 80 acres. I need to be honest with you, Julian said slowly. I don't know what I'm doing here. I came to Iowa to escape, to rebuild my life away from everything I'd failed at. I wasn't planning on being responsible for anyone else. No one's asking you to be responsible for us, Beatrice said. We take care of ourselves. We're just asking for permission to keep doing what we've been doing. It's not that simple, Julian said. The county program has requirements. I have to prove I'm maintaining the property, making improvements. If they think I'm running some kind of commune or will help with improvements, Valeria interrupted. We already have been. Who do you think fixed that irrigation system? June's late husband was a plumber. She knows more about pipe and water pressure than anyone in 3 counties. June nodded modestly. It's not complicated once you understand the basics. And I can do electrical work, Faye said. I'm certified. I used to help my father with his contracting business before. She stopped, leaving the rest unsaid. Iris spoke for the first time that day, her voice soft but clear. I don't have practical skills like that, but I can cook and I can clean, and I can help with whatever needs doing. My husband always said I was good at making things work with nothing. Julian felt something shifting inside him, a resistance giving way to possibility. These women weren't asking for charity. They were offering partnership, their skills and labor, in exchange for access to land that was sitting empty anyway. What about the harvest, he asked. The wheat, whose is it? Beatrice considered this. We planted it, but it's your land. Legally, it's yours. We'd like to split it if you're willing. Half to us for our labor, half to you for the land use. That's not, Julian started, then stopped. He'd done nothing to earn that wheat. Keep it all. Sell it, use it, whatever you need. Consider it payment for the work you've already done maintaining this place. The women exchanged glances, surprise and relief evident on their faces. That's generous, Beatrice said carefully. But we should contribute something toward property taxes, upkeep costs. We're not looking for handouts. Then we'll figure out something fair, Julian said. After I understand what the county actually requires and what you all need. Valeria shifted, her expression still guarded. Just so you know, my ex-husband might become a problem. He's been making noise about custody, showing up at Sophia's school. If he finds out where we're living, is he dangerous? Julian asked. He can be. Valeria's jaw tightened. He never hit the kids, but he hit me plenty. That's why I left. But he's the kind of man who sees everything as property, including his family. Julian felt anger kindle in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't expected. If he shows up here, I'll handle it. You don't have to, Valeria began. Yes, I do, Julian said simply. If you're staying here, even temporarily, then I'm responsible for making sure it's safe. The afternoon stretched into evening, and the conversation turned practical. They discussed crop rotation, equipment needs, the logistics of multiple families using the land without getting in each other's way. Julian learned that Beatrice had been coordinating everything, keeping schedules and resolving conflicts, essentially managing a small agricultural cooperative without formal structure. We should write this down, Julian said finally. Some kind of agreement so everyone knows what to expect. Are you saying we can stay? June asked, hope clear in her weathered face. Julian looked at each of them, Beatrice with her quiet strength, June with her skillful hands, Faye with her careful intelligence, Valeria with her fierce protection of her children, Iris with her gentle determination. He thought about Thornton's journal, about the old man's regret over his own children and his redemption through helping others. I'm saying we can try, Julian said. I can't promise it'll work long term. The county might have issues, and I need to make sure I'm meeting the program requirements. But for now, yes. Finish out the season. We'll see how it goes. Beatrice stood and extended her hand again, as she had that first day in the wheat field. This time Julian took it. "Thank you," she said. "You won't regret this." Julian hoped she was right. That night, after everyone had left, Julian called Wyatt. The phone rang 4 times before his son answered. "Hey, Dad. Hey, buddy. How are you?" "Fine. Busy." Wyatt's voice carried the distracted tone of a teenager who had better things to do. "I wanted to tell you about something. I bought a farm in Iowa." A pause. "Seriously?" $1. County program. "It needs a lot of work, but it's got good land and—" Julian hesitated, then continued. "There are some people here who are helping me. Women who've been farming the land. It's complicated, but I think we're going to make it work." "That's cool, I guess." Wyatt didn't sound particularly interested. "Maybe you could visit sometime. See the place. There's room and I could use help with some projects." "Yeah, maybe." "I gotta go, Dad. Mom's calling me for dinner." "Okay, love you, Wyatt." "Yeah, you too. Bye." The line went dead, and Julian sat holding the phone, feeling the familiar hollow ache of distance. But underneath it, for the first time in months, was something else. A small, fragile sense of purpose. He looked out at the dark fields, at the farmhouse that was slowly becoming livable, at the barn where equipment was stored and plans were forming. He thought about Thornton's words. Maybe it's not too late to be the kind of man who makes room instead of walls. Maybe it wasn't too late for Julian either. The next 2 weeks established a rhythm Julian hadn't anticipated. The women came most days, sometimes all together, sometimes in pairs, working various sections of the property. Beatrice coordinated schedules with the efficiency of a general, ensuring no one's efforts overlapped wastefully. June worked on the irrigation system, replacing old pipes and teaching Julian the intricacies of water pressure and flow rates. Faye rewired the barn, installing proper lighting and outlets. Valeria managed the vegetable gardens, her children helping with weeding and watering. Julian found himself falling into the pattern, his days structured around shared meals and collaborative work. He was sleeping better, eating better, feeling useful in a way he hadn't since the carpentry business collapsed. But the question of permanence hung over everything. One morning, Julian drove to the county office in the larger town, 30 miles away. The building was institutional and tired, with fluorescent lights and worn linoleum. He found the land management office on the 2nd floor and waited 20 minutes to speak with a clerk named Delphine Patterson, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain. "I need to understand the requirements for the revitalization program," Julian said, sliding his property deed across the counter. Delphine examined the document, typed something into her computer. "Standard program. You maintain the property, make improvements, reside there primarily for 5 years. After that, it's yours, free and clear." "What about other people living on the property?" Delphine looked up, her expression neutral. "Family members are fine, but the program is designed for single-family residential use, not boarding houses or rental situations. What if I had people helping me farm the land? Not renters, but like a cooperative arrangement." Delphine's eyes narrowed slightly. "You talking about the Thornton property?" "Yes." She sat back in her chair. "We had questions about that place. Old man was letting people squat there for years. County turned a blind eye because he was maintaining it, but technically it violated several ordinances." Julian felt his stomach tighten. "The women working the land now, they've been maintaining it better than I could alone. They're helping me meet the program requirements." "Maybe so," Delphine said. "But if you're running some kind of commune situation, that's outside the scope of the program. County's trying to revitalize properties with stable family residences, not create agricultural collectives. It's not a commune. It's me learning to farm with help from people who know what they're doing." Delphine studied him for a long moment. "Word of advice. Keep your head down. Do the work, file your progress reports, don't make noise. County board's got enough headaches without adding complications." She slid the deed back to him. "But if someone complains, or if it looks like you're not meeting the spirit of the program, they can revoke your agreement and reclaim the property." Julian left the office feeling unsettled. The arrangement that had seemed workable suddenly felt precarious. built on bureaucratic goodwill that could evaporate with a single complaint or policy change. When he returned to the farm, Beatrice was waiting on the porch with a troubled expression. "What's wrong?" Julian asked. "Might be nothing," she said. But June heard talk at the diner. "Some folks in town are questioning why you've got women coming and going all the time. People are starting to gossip." Julian sat down heavily on the porch steps. "I was just at the county office. They made it clear this setup could be a problem." "What kind of problem?" He explained the regulations, the single-family requirement, the precarious nature of his claim to the land. Beatrice listened quietly, her face growing more concerned. "So we're putting your ownership at risk," she said finally. "I don't know, maybe. The clerk said to keep a low profile, but small towns notice everything," Beatrice finished. She was quiet for a moment, then stood. "I'll talk to the others. We can scale back, come less frequently. Whatever it takes to protect what you've got here. That defeats the purpose," Julian said. "You need the land. And honestly, I need the help. Not if it costs you everything." That evening, Julian sat alone and reread portions of Thornton's journal. He found an entry from 2017. "County inspector came by today, asking questions about who's been using the property. I told him I have family and friends who help with the farm." Not exactly a lie. These women are more family to me now than my blood relatives ever were. He seemed satisfied, but I worry. The rules are written by people who've never been hungry, never been desperate. They don't understand what this place means. Julian understood now. The land's value wasn't in its 80 acres or its productive soil. It was in what it provided: safety, purpose, community. And that value existed outside any bureaucratic framework designed to measure and control it. The next morning, Valeria's ex-husband showed up. Julian was working on the porch railing when a lifted pickup truck came roaring up the drive, music blasting from open windows. A man climbed out, early 30s, muscular, with aggressive energy radiating from every movement. He wore expensive sunglasses and a t-shirt deliberately sized too small. "Where's Valeria?" he demanded, not bothering with introductions. Julian set down his hammer slowly. "Who's asking?" "Her husband." "Where is she?" "Ex-husband," Julian corrected. "And she's not here." The man, Valeria had called him Derek, stepped closer. "Don't play games with me, old man. I know she's been coming here. I got people watching." "Then your people told you she's not here right now," Julian said evenly. "And I'd appreciate you leaving." Derek laughed, a harsh sound. "This is rich. She's got you playing protector? How much is she paying you?" He looked around at the property with exaggerated assessment. "Or is it some other kind of payment?" Julian felt anger rise hot in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "You need to leave, now. I need to see my kids. She's keeping them from me, and that's illegal. The custody arrangement is between you and her. This is private property, and you're trespassing." Derek took another step forward, close enough that Julian could smell cologne mixed with the sour edge of aggression. "You threatening me?" "Stating facts." For a moment, Julian thought Derek might swing at him. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight. But then headlights appeared on the drive, Beatrice's truck, arriving for the day's work. Beatrice climbed out and assessed the situation instantly. She walked over with the same calm she'd shown that first day in the wheat field. "Morning, Derek," she said. "Valeria's not here. She's in town with the kids. And you know the court order says you can't harass her at her workplace or residence." "This isn't her residence," Derek spat. "It is now," Beatrice said simply. "And if you want to modify your custody arrangement, you do it through the courts, not by showing up and making threats." Derek looked between Beatrice and Julian, his aggression finding no purchase. Finally, he stepped back. "Tell her I know where she is now. Tell her I'm watching. She can't hide forever." He climbed back in his truck and peeled out, gravel spraying. Julian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That going to be a problem?" "He's always a problem," Beatrice said. "But he's mostly talk. He wants to intimidate, not actually face consequences. Still, we should let Valeria know he was here." Julian nodded, feeling the weight of new responsibilities settling on his shoulders. He'd thought protecting the women meant ensuring they had access to land. He hadn't considered it might mean standing between them and men like Derek. That afternoon, when Valeria arrived, Julian told her about the visit. She went pale, then angry. "He's supposed to stay away from me except scheduled visits with the kids," she said. The court was clear. "Would he actually hurt you?" Julian asked. "I don't know anymore. When I was married to him, yes. Now?" She shook her head. "He's remarried, moved on in some ways. But he can't stand that I left him, that I'm doing okay without him. He wants to prove I need him, even if that means destroying what I've built." Julian understood that kind of controlling bitterness. He'd seen it in clients during his carpentry days, men who'd rather tear things down than admit they'd lost. "We'll keep an eye out," he said. "And if he comes back, we call the sheriff." "Thank you," Valeria said quietly, "for standing up to him. Not many people do." That night, Julian lay awake thinking about the conversation with the county clerk, about Derek's threats, about the fragility of what they were trying to build. The farm had seemed like an escape, a place to be alone and safe. Instead, it had become something more complicated, a refuge for others, a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't abandon. He thought about Wyatt, about the custody hearing, about the judge's words. The child needs stability, not a parent in constant crisis. Was this stable? Or was Julian repeating old patterns, taking on more than he could handle, heading toward another spectacular failure? But then he remembered Beatrice's handshake, June's gratitude, Iris's quiet determination. He remembered Sophia and Luis playing in the yard, their laughter bright and uncomplicated. Maybe stability wasn't about avoiding complexity. Maybe it was about choosing what you stood for and standing firm, even when the ground got uncertain. Julian reached for Thornton's journal one more time, finding comfort in the old man's voice, in his struggles and small victories. And somewhere past midnight, he finally fell asleep with the journal open on his chest and the sound of night wind moving through the wheat like a promise he was only beginning to understand. August brought heat that shimmered across the fields and a harvest that exceeded everyone's expectations. The wheat had been stored and sold, bringing in more money than Julian had seen in months. He'd insisted on splitting the proceeds evenly, despite the women's protests. They'd compromised by pooling the money for farm improvements. A new well, pump lumber for barn repairs, proper fencing to replace the rusted wire that sagged between rotted posts. The work became a shared endeavor in ways Julian hadn't anticipated. He taught Faye's daughter Penelope basic carpentry while they repaired the fence line. The girl was 10, curious and careful with tools, asking questions that reminded him painfully of Wyatt at that age. Valeria's son Luis followed Julian everywhere, handing him nails and holding boards steady, chattering about tractors and asking if they could get chickens. "Maybe," Julian found himself saying, "we'd need to build a coop first." "I could help," Luis said eagerly. "I'm strong." The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and before he knew it, Julian was sketching plans for a chicken coop on a scrap of plywood, Luis watching over his shoulder with intense concentration. But the deeper Julian waded into this improvised community, the more he felt the current pulling at him. He was becoming attached to the land, to the rhythm of shared work, to these people who'd entered his life uninvited and made themselves essential. One afternoon in late August, June collapsed while working in the garden. Julian heard Iris's cry and ran to find the elderly woman on her knees, one hand pressed to her chest, her face grey and slick with sweat. Beatrice was already there, helping June to the shade, while Faye called for an ambulance. "I'm fine," June protested weakly. "Just got overheated." "You're not fine," Beatrice said firmly. "This is the third time this month you've had chest pains." The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive. Julian rode with June to the hospital in the next county, holding her weathered hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. In the emergency room, nurses whisked her away, leaving Julian in the waiting area with forms he couldn't answer, her insurance information, her medical history, her next of kin. Beatrice arrived an hour later with the necessary paperwork. She listed me as her emergency contact, she explained. Her daughter's in California. I called her, but she can't get a flight until tomorrow. They waited together, drinking bad coffee from a vending machine. Julian learned that June had been ignoring symptoms for weeks, refusing to see a doctor because she couldn't afford the co-pays on her Medicare. She was afraid of more medical bills, Beatrice said quietly. After what happened with her husband, she's terrified of debt. Julian felt anger simmer in his chest, not at June, but at a system that made elderly women choose between their health and financial ruin. When the doctor finally emerged to say June was stable but needed to stay for observation and tests, Julian asked about costs. "We'll work with her on payment plans," the doctor said with practiced sympathy that barely masked the underlying message. Someone would pay eventually. Julian drove Beatrice back to the farm as sunset painted the sky orange and purple. They sat in the truck for a moment, neither quite ready to leave the day's crisis behind. "She's going to be okay," Beatrice said, more statement than question. "I hope so." Julian rubbed his face, exhausted. She shouldn't have been working so hard in this heat. Tried telling June that. "She's the most stubborn woman I know, and that's saying something." Beatrice managed a small smile. "But she's also the kindest. When my Carl died, when I lost everything, June was the first person to reach out. She didn't have anything herself, but she shared what she had." Over the next week, they took turns, visiting June in the hospital and then at the rehabilitation facility where she was transferred. The diagnosis was angina, not a heart attack, but a warning sign. She needed rest, medication, lifestyle changes. She also needed follow-up appointments and ongoing care that her limited insurance only partially covered. Julian found himself at the county hospital's billing office, negotiating payment arrangements he had no business making. When the administrator quoted the remaining costs after insurance, Julian put it on a credit card he'd promised himself he'd only use for emergencies. This was an emergency, he reasoned. June had given her labor freely to maintain the farm. The least he could do was ensure she got proper medical care. When June was finally released, Julian insisted she stay in the farmhouse rather than return to her daughter's basement 2 counties away. He'd moved into one of the upstairs rooms. Anyway, and the main floor bedroom was perfectly suitable. "I can't impose like that," June protested, but her relief was evident. "You're not imposing, you're recovering, and someone needs to be here to make sure you take your medications and don't overdo it." Beatrice organized a care rotation, with someone checking on June daily. Faye brought meals. Iris helped with bathing and dressing. Valeria's children read to her from library books, their young voices filling the farmhouse with sound and life. Julian found himself transformed into a reluctant household manager, coordinating schedules and ensuring June had everything she needed. It was exhausting and occasionally frustrating, but it was also oddly fulfilling, a purpose that extended beyond his own survival. One evening, sitting on the porch with June while she rested in a wicker chair wrapped in blankets despite the August heat, she spoke softly. "You didn't have to do this. Pay my hospital bills, let me stay here. You barely know me." "I know enough," Julian said. "You helped maintain this place when you had every reason not to. You gave your time and skill freely. That counts for something." June was quiet for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "My husband and I were married 43 years. We raised 3 children, built a good life. Then cancer came, and all that time, all that building, it couldn't protect us. The bills came, and we lost everything trying to stay alive a little longer." Her voice didn't break, but Julian heard the weight of old grief in it. "After he died, I wanted to die too," June continued. "Not actively, but I stopped caring, stopped trying. It was Mr. Thornton who pulled me back. He gave me dirt to work, seeds to plant, a reason to wake up. He saved my life, really." She turned to look at Julian, her eyes sharp despite her physical frailty. "Now you're doing the same thing. Not just for me, for all of us. You don't have to, but you are. That makes you a good man, Julian Graves." Julian didn't feel like a good man. He felt like someone stumbling through circumstances he barely understood, making decisions based on instinct rather than wisdom. But June's words settled something in him, a quiet affirmation that maybe he was heading in the right direction, even if the path was unclear. The next afternoon, Beatrice arrived with a gift, a quilt carefully folded in her arms. She spread it across the porch railing for Julian to see. It was beautiful, made of squares in different patterns and colors, each one distinct but harmonious with the whole. "We made this," Beatrice said. "All of us together. Each square represents something, a memory, a loss, a hope. This one's June's, from fabric of her husband's favorite shirt. This one's Valeria's, from Sophia's baby blanket. Faye used fabric from the dress she wore the day she left her husband. Iris used part of her military flag." She pointed to each square in turn, and Julian saw the stories woven into cloth, pain, transformed into pattern, loss becoming part of something larger and more beautiful. "This square is yours," Beatrice said, touching a piece of deep blue denim, "from those work pants you wore the first day you helped harvest. You said you could figure it out, and you did. You figured out more than just how to swing a scythe." Julian felt his throat tighten. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep it. Hang it somewhere you'll see it. Remember that you're not alone here, and neither are we. We're building something together." That evening, Julian hung the quilt on the wall of his bedroom. He lay on his sleeping bag and looked at it, tracing the patterns with his eyes, thinking about the women who'd made it and what they represented. Resilience, community, hope in the face of loss. He thought about calling Wyatt, sharing this moment, but decided against it. His son wouldn't understand yet. Maybe someday he would, but not now. Instead, Julian pulled out his phone and typed a message. "Hey, buddy, just wanted you to know I'm thinking about you. The farm's doing well. Made some good friends here. Would still love for you to visit if you ever want to. Love, Dad." He hit send before he could second-guess it, then set the phone aside and closed his eyes. Outside, cicadas sang their late summer song, and somewhere in the house, June was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. Julian felt, for the first time in a very long time, like he was exactly where he needed to be. September arrived with cooler mornings and the promise of autumn. The farm had settled into a rhythm that felt almost permanent. Vegetable gardens heavy with late-season tomatoes and squash, the barn fully repaired, June recovering steadily in the farmhouse. Julian had begun thinking about winter preparations, about insulation and firewood, and what crops might be planted in spring. Then the county official arrived. Julian was working on the chicken coop, Luis's dream finally becoming reality, when a sedan with county government plates pulled up the drive. A man in his 50s emerged, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone delivering bad news. "Julian Graves?" "That's me. I'm Howard Lynch, County Compliance Officer. I need to speak with you about your property." Julian set down his hammer, dread settling in his stomach. "What about it?" Lynch glanced around the property, taking in the multiple vehicles, the gardens, the obvious signs of more than one person living there. "We've received information that you're operating this property in violation of the revitalization program terms. The program specifically requires single-family residential use. What you've got here appears to be multiple families, possibly a communal living situation. I'm farming the land with help from people who know what they're doing," Julian said carefully. "That's not against the rules. It is if they're residing here. The program isn't designed to support agricultural cooperatives or multifamily arrangements." Lynch consulted his clipboard. "I'm authorized to conduct an inspection. I'll need to see the interior of all structures and speak with anyone currently on the property." Julian's hands clenched. "Who filed the complaint?" "That information is confidential, but Julian could guess. Derek, Valeria's ex-husband, had made good on his threat to cause problems." Lynch spent the next hour documenting everything. He photographed the farmhouse, noting June's presence in the downstairs bedroom. He walked the property, counting garden plots and storage areas. He asked pointed questions about who lived where and how often people came and went. Beatrice arrived midway through the inspection and immediately understood what was happening. She stood beside Julian, her face carefully neutral, while Lynch continued his assessment. When he finished, Lynch delivered the verdict. Mr. Graves, based on what I've observed, this property is not being used in accordance with revitalization program requirements. You have 30 days to bring the property into compliance, meaning single-family residential use only, or the county will initiate proceedings to reclaim the land. You're saying everyone has to leave, Julian said flatly. I'm saying the property must be used as specified in your agreement. How you achieve that is up to you. Lynch handed him a formal notice. You can appeal this determination to the county board, but I should tell you that the board has been made aware of a development interest in this area. A company called Midwest Agricultural Holdings has been purchasing properties for industrial farming operations. If you forfeit this land, the county intends to resell it to them. After Lynch drove away, Julian and Beatrice stood in stunned silence. Valeria, who'd been working in the back garden and heard the entire exchange, emerged with tears of anger on her face. This is Derek's doing. He's been watching, gathering evidence, finding ways to hurt me. It's not just Derek, Beatrice said quietly. There's been talk in town. People see what we're doing here and they don't understand it, or they're threatened by it. A group of women making it work without men, without the traditional structure that makes some folks uncomfortable. Julian read through the notice, his mind racing. We have 30 days. There has to be a way to fight this. Fight with what? Valeria asked bitterly. We don't have money for lawyers. And even if we did, the law's pretty clear. You signed an agreement for single-family use. That evening, they gathered in the farmhouse, all 5 women, Julian, and even the children, because there was no point hiding the crisis from them. Julian laid out the situation as clearly as he could. The county wants to reclaim the property. If that happens, a corporation will buy it and turn it into industrial farmland. Everything we've built here gone. What if we all left except June? Iris suggested. She's recovering. She needs to be here. That's single family. June's not my family, legally speaking, Julian said. And they documented all of you being here, all the garden plots, everything. Faye, who'd been quiet, suddenly spoke up. What about forming a legal cooperative? I've been reading about agricultural cooperatives. They're legitimate business structures. If we incorporated as a farm cooperative, with you as the primary resident and us as working members, that might satisfy the requirements. Would that work? Valeria asked. I don't know, Faye admitted. But it's worth researching. Beatrice nodded slowly. It would give us legal standing. Make this official instead of informal. But setting up a cooperative takes time and money. How much money? Julian asked. Legal fees, filing costs, probably a few $1,000s at minimum. The room went silent. No one had that kind of money. I have some savings, Iris said softly, from my husband's life insurance. It's not much, but I could contribute. Absolutely not, Julian said firmly. That money is for you and your daughter. This place is for us, Iris replied. If we lose it, I lose the only stable home my daughter's ever known. That insurance money doesn't mean anything if we don't have anywhere to live. Valeria stood abruptly. I need to confront Derek, end this. That's what he wants, Beatrice warned. To provoke you, get you to do something that gives him leverage in the custody situation. So what do we do? Let him destroy everything? Julian thought about Thornton's journal, about the old man's quiet resistance against rules that didn't account for human need. He thought about Wyatt, about wanting his son to see him as someone who stood for something, who didn't back down when things got difficult. We fight, Julian said. We find a lawyer, we form the cooperative, and we make our case to the county board. We show them what this place means, not just to us, but to the community. The community? Faye said. Most of Ferndale thinks we're strange. Some do, but not all. There are people who remember Thornton, who benefited from his generosity. The pastor at the church, the folks at the food bank, families who've received vegetables from our gardens. We need to remind the county that this farm serves a purpose beyond property values and development deals. Beatrice studied Julian's face. You're really willing to fight this? You could walk away, find another property, start over somewhere else without all these complications. I could, Julian agreed. But I won't. This land, it's not just mine anymore. It hasn't been since that first day I found you harvesting wheat. We're in this together now. Over the following week, they mobilized. Faye researched cooperative law and found a lawyer in Des Moines willing to work on a sliding scale. Beatrice organized community outreach, visiting neighbors and local businesses to build support. Valeria, despite her fear of Derek's retaliation, spoke to the local newspaper about the farm's mission. Julian spent hours on the phone with county officials, appealing the compliance ruling and requesting a hearing before the board. He read every word of the revitalization program guidelines, looking for loopholes or alternative interpretations. June, still recovering but determined to help, made phone calls from her bed, reaching out to people Thornton had helped over the years. One by one they agreed to speak on the farm's behalf. But the situation grew more complicated when a representative from Midwest Agricultural Holdings visited the property. He was smooth, professional, carrying an air of inevitability. He walked the land with Julian, pointing out its potential for large-scale operations, its proximity to grain elevators, its excellent soil quality. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000 for this property," he said. "Significantly more than the dollar you paid. You could start fresh somewhere else, without all these legal complications." Julian looked at the fields, at the farmhouse where June was recovering, at the garden where Valeria's children were playing. He thought about what $50,000 could mean. A new start, maybe enough to improve his custody situation with Wyatt. "The land's not for sale," he said. The representative smiled slightly. "The land may not be yours to keep, Mr. Graves. The county's ready to reclaim it. When they do, we'll be ready to purchase. I'm simply offering you the courtesy of getting something out of this situation rather than nothing." After the man left, Julian sat on the porch and stared at the notice from the county. 30 days! 4 weeks to save something that had taken months to build and years before that to establish. That night, he opened Thornton's journal to one of the final entries. "I know my time's running out. Doctor says maybe 6 months. I worry about what happens to this place after I'm gone, about the women who depend on it. I've tried to set things up so they'll be protected, but I'm not sure it's enough. The world doesn't care much for people who fall through the cracks. Maybe I should have done more, documented better, made it more official. But I wanted this place to stay what it was, a refuge, not an institution. Sometimes the best things in life can't be captured in paperwork." Julian closed the journal and looked at the quilt hanging on his wall, at the squares representing loss and hope woven together. He thought about June's words. "You're doing the same thing. You're saving lives." He couldn't walk away, even if it meant losing everything again, even if it meant fighting a system designed to favor corporate interests over human need. He had to try. Because some things were worth more than property values and legal compliance. Some things, community, belonging, the chance to be someone who stood firm, those things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The days shortened and the fight intensified. Julian threw himself into preparing their case with the single-minded focus he'd once brought to his carpentry business. He woke before dawn, made coffee, and spent hours researching agricultural law, cooperative structures, and county ordinances. The farmhouse kitchen table became command center, covered in legal documents, notes, and timelines. The lawyer Faye had found, a woman named Patricia Drummond, drove out from Des Moines to assess their situation. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She walked the property, interviewed each of the women, and reviewed every document Julian had. "You've got a legitimate case," she said finally, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee June had made. "The revitalization program doesn't explicitly prohibit agricultural cooperatives. The county's interpretation is conservative, but it's not the only valid interpretation. So we can win?" Valeria asked hopefully. "I didn't say that." Patricia sipped her coffee. "The county has broad discretion. They can claim you're violating the spirit of the program, even if you're technically within the letter. And with a development company waiting in the wings offering tax revenue and jobs, the board has incentive to rule against you. Then what do? Julian asked. We make this about more than legal technicalities. We make it about community impact, about what this farm represents. We get people to show up at the hearing and testify. We show the board that shutting this down would hurt real people, damage community well-being. Patricia looked around at the women. You need to tell your stories publicly, all of them. Make the board see you as human beings, not legal problems. The idea of public testimony terrified most of them. Valeria worried Derek would use it against her in custody proceedings. Iris hated attention, preferred invisibility. Even Beatrice, usually so steady, expressed doubts. What if we tell our stories and they don't care? She asked. Then at least you'll know you tried, Patricia said simply. They organized a community meeting at the Ferndale Church to build support before the county hearing. Pastor Reynolds, who'd known Thornton well, offered the fellowship hall. Beatrice spent days calling everyone she could think of. People Thornton had helped, families who'd received vegetables from the farm, local business owners. The night of the meeting, Julian stood at the church entrance watching people arrive. Some faces were familiar from town, others complete strangers. A reporter from the county newspaper came with a camera. Julian's stomach churned with nervousness. 70 people crowded into the fellowship hall. Beatrice stood at the front and told her story. The farm foreclosure, sleeping in her truck, Thornton's kindness. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she described what the farm had given her. Purpose, dignity, community. June spoke next, her voice soft but clear. She described losing everything to medical bills, the despair that had nearly consumed her, the salvation of dirt and seeds, and the simple act of growing food. Faye told about fleeing her abusive husband with her daughter, about teaching school during the week and growing vegetables on weekends, about how the farm had given Penelope a safe place to play and learned that women could be strong. When Valeria stood, her hands trembled. My ex-husband is the one who filed the complaint against this farm. He wants to punish me for leaving him, for choosing my children's safety over his control. But this place, her voice caught, this place taught my kids what real family looks like. Not blood or marriage licenses, but people who show up for each other, who work together, who build something good. Iris was last. She held her infant daughter and spoke so quietly people had to lean forward to hear. My husband died serving his country. The military gave me a flag and a check and then forgot about me. Mr. Thornton didn't forget. He gave me a place to live when I had nowhere else. Julian continued that kindness. This farm saves lives. It saved mine. When the women finished, people from the community stood to speak. The pastor talked about Thornton's legacy and the Christian duty to help those in need. A farmer described how Thornton had helped him during a drought by sharing water access. A single mother testified that vegetables from the farm had fed her children when food stamps ran short. An elderly man Julian had never met stood and said, Thornton pulled me out of a depression after my wife died. Gave me work to do, purpose. I'm alive today because of that farm. If you shut it down, you're destroying something irreplaceable. The meeting ran 2 hours, and by the end, people were signing a petition supporting the farm. The reporter took photographs and interviewed Julian, asking questions about his vision for the property. I didn't have a vision when I arrived, Julian admitted. I just wanted to be left alone. These women taught me that isolation isn't the same as peace. They taught me that community, real community, is worth fighting for. The newspaper ran the story the following week under the headline, Farm Faces Shutdown Despite Community Support. The article was fair, presenting both the county's position and the farm's defense. Julian bought 10 copies and sent one to Wyatt with a note. This is what I'm doing now. This is who I'm trying to be. As the hearing date approached, Derek escalated his campaign. He filed a custody modification request, claiming Valeria was living in unstable conditions. He showed up at Sophia's school, causing a scene that required the principal's intervention. He posted on social media, calling the farm a cult and Julian a con man. Valeria was crumbling under the pressure. Julian found her crying in the barn one afternoon, her face buried in her hands. "He's going to win," she said. "He's going to take my kids and destroy this place, and there's nothing I can do." Julian sat beside her. "He only wins if you let fear control you. You left him because you're strong, not weak. Remember that." "I don't feel strong. Strength isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite being terrified." Julian thought about his own fears, of failure, of losing Wyatt forever, of building something only to watch it collapse again. "We're all scared. But we're not backing down." 3 days before the hearing, Patricia called with both good and bad news. "I found something in the county records. Thornton filed an agricultural easement on the property years ago, designating it for community agricultural use in perpetuity. It was filed but poorly documented, basically buried in old paperwork." "What does that mean?" Julian asked. "It means the property has legal protection for multifamily agricultural operations. The easement supersedes the revitalization program requirements." She paused. "But here's the problem. The county can challenge the easement's validity. It was filed shortly before Thornton's death, and there are questions about whether he had legal capacity to execute it. We'll need to prove it's legitimate. How do we do that?" "We find evidence that Thornton intended the easement, that he was of sound mind, that this wasn't some last-minute whim. Do you have any documentation? Letters, journals, anything showing his long-term plans for the property?" Julian looked at Thornton's journal sitting on the kitchen counter. "I might have exactly what we need." He spent that night carefully photographing relevant journal entries, years of documentation showing Thornton's deliberate, sustained commitment to making the farm a community resource. His clear mind, his thoughtful reasoning, his consistent vision over decades. Patricia reviewed the photographs and called back within hours. "This is gold. This proves intent, establishes pattern, demonstrates capacity. I can build a case around this." The night before the hearing, the women and Julian gathered at the farmhouse. June cooked a proper dinner, roasted chicken, vegetables from the garden, fresh bread. They ate together, talking quietly about everything except the next day's proceedings. After dinner, as darkness settled over the farm, they sat on the porch. Sophia and Luis played in the yard, catching fireflies in jars. Iris rocked her daughter, humming softly. Beatrice and June sat in companionable silence. Valeria turned to Julian. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know, this mattered. What you did, letting us stay, fighting for us. It mattered. It mattered to me too," Julian said. He thought about the man who'd arrived here months ago, broken, isolated, wanting nothing more than to disappear. That man was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that meaning came not from avoiding loss, but from choosing what to fight for. His phone buzzed. "A text from Wyatt? I read the article. What you're doing is pretty cool, Dad. Good luck tomorrow." Julian stared at the message, reading it 3 times. Not much, just a few words, but more than he'd gotten in months, more than he'd hoped for. He typed back, "Thanks, buddy." That means everything. As the stars emerged overhead and the fireflies danced in the darkening yard, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope mixed with purpose, fear tempered by resolve. Tomorrow they would face the county board. Tomorrow they would learn whether laws and paperwork could recognize what they'd built here, or whether bureaucracy would crush something beautiful simply because it didn't fit the expected form. But tonight, sitting on this porch with these people who'd become family, Julian knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The county board meeting room was packed. Julian arrived early with Patricia and found every seat filled, people lining the walls, the air thick with tension and body heat. He recognized faces from the community meeting, the pastor, farmers, families. The women sat together in the front row, Beatrice holding June's hand, Valeria pale but steady. Derek sat in the back, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. Beside him was a man in an expensive suit, presumably the representative from Midwest Agricultural Holdings. The county board consisted of 5 members seated at a raised table facing the crowd. The chairman, a stern man in his 70s named Gerald Ashford, called the meeting to order at precisely 6 o'clock. "Item 7 on tonight's agenda," he announced, reading from his papers. "Appeal of compliance determination for property located at 1847 County Road 18. Currently held by Julian Graves under the County Revitalization Program. Mr. Lynch, please present the county's position." Howard Lynch stood and delivered his report with bureaucratic precision. Multiple families residing on property designated for single-family use. Gardens and structures indicating permanent multi-resident occupation. Clear violation of program terms. He displayed photographs taken during his inspection, each one showing evidence that contradicted the single-family requirement. The revitalization program exists to stabilize rural properties through traditional family residences, Lynch concluded. What we see here is an unauthorized agricultural collective that violates both the letter and spirit of the program. The county recommends termination of Mr. Graves's agreement and reclamation of the property. The board members listened impassively. 2 were taking notes. A younger woman named Sandra Pierce watched the crowd with thoughtful attention. Patricia stood to present their defense. She was calm, professional, moving through their argument with practiced skill. She explained the legal structure of agricultural cooperatives, cited precedents from other counties, argued that the revitalization program's purpose was property improvement and maintenance, goals they'd clearly achieved. The property is productive, well-maintained, and serves the community, Patricia said. Mr. Graves has invested labor and capital into improvements. The women working this land have transformed it from abandoned to thriving. This is exactly what the revitalization program should encourage. Chairman Ashford leaned forward. The program encourages family stability, not communal arrangements. We have rules for a reason. Then let me introduce new evidence, Patricia said. She produced copies of Thornton's agricultural easement, distributing them to each board member. The previous owner, Mr. Thornton, filed a permanent agricultural easement designating this property for community agricultural use. This easement was legally executed and filed with the county. It supersedes program restrictions. The board members examined the documents, expressions shifting from certainty to uncertainty. Lynch stood quickly. This easement was filed shortly before Mr. Thornton's death. There are legitimate questions about his mental capacity at that time, which is why we have supporting documentation, Patricia countered. She produced copies of the journal entries Julian had photographed, years of clear, consistent writing, showing Thornton's long-term intent. Mr. Thornton maintained detailed records over decades. These entries demonstrate sustained purpose, clear reasoning, and deliberate planning. He was of sound mind when he executed the easement, fulfilling intentions he'd held for years. She handed the journal copies to the board. Julian watched them read, saw expressions soften as Thornton's voice came through, his loneliness, his regret over his own children, his redemption through helping others. Chairman Ashford cleared his throat. We'll need time to review these documents and consult with county legal counsel about the easement's validity. With respect, Mr. Chairman, the easement is valid on its face, Patricia said. But beyond legal technicalities, this is about community values. I'd like to call witnesses to testify about this farm's impact. Ashford looked at the crowded room and nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes each. Beatrice testified first, her voice steady despite obvious nerves. She described the farm's history, Thornton's vision, the lives that had been changed and saved. She spoke about dignity and second chances, about women who'd fallen through society's cracks finding solid ground. June followed, talking about loss and recovery, about how growing food had given her reason to keep living after her husband's death. Her soft voice carried weight, and several board members leaned forward to hear. Faye testified about domestic violence, about the impossibility of starting over with nothing, about how the farm had provided both food and hope. She mentioned her daughter Penelope, how the girl had learned strength from watching women work together. When Valeria stood, her voice shook. My ex-husband filed the complaint that started this. He wants to punish me for leaving him, for choosing safety over submission. But this farm gave me more than vegetables or shelter. It gave me a community that showed me what family should look like, people who support instead of control, who build up instead of tear down. She looked directly at Derek in the back row. You can hurt me, but you can't destroy what we've built here. You don't have that power anymore. Derek's face flushed with anger, but he stayed silent. Iris was last, speaking barely above a whisper while holding her daughter. I'm 23 years old and I'm a widow. The world doesn't care much about young widows with babies. We're invisible. But Mr. Thornton saw me. Julian saw me. This farm sees all of us. The invisible, the forgotten, the ones who don't fit anywhere else. If you shut this down, you're saying we don't matter. After the women finished, community members testified. The pastor spoke about Thornton's faith in action, about Christian duty to help the vulnerable. Local farmers described how the farm contributed to the regional agricultural economy. A social worker from the county testified that the women's arrangement represented exactly the kind of community support that prevented homelessness and family crisis. An elderly woman stood, her voice trembling with emotion. My husband and I knew Thornton for 40 years. He was a good man who made mistakes with his own family and spent his final years trying to do better. That easement wasn't some crazy last-minute decision. It was the culmination of everything he believed in. Honor it. The testimony went on for over an hour. Julian watched the board members' faces, trying to read their thoughts. Sandra Pierce seemed sympathetic. Two others appeared genuinely moved, but Chairman Ashford and one other man maintained skeptical expressions. Finally, Ashford called for a recess. The board will deliberate and vote after reviewing the easement documentation. Mr. Graves, your attorney, and county legal counsel will meet with us in the conference room. The crowd murmured as people stood and stretched. Julian followed Patricia into a small conference room where the board members gathered around a table, with the easement and journal entries spread before them. The question before us is straightforward, Ashford said. Is this easement legitimate and binding, or can it be challenged based on Thornton's mental state at the time of execution? The county attorney, a young man named Philip Webster, reviewed the documents carefully. The easement appears properly executed, witnessed, notarized, filed correctly. The journal entries support Mr. Thornton's capacity and intent. Challenging this would require proving incompetence, which these records make difficult. So the easement stands? Sandra Pierce asked. Webster nodded reluctantly. Unless we want expensive litigation with uncertain outcome, yes. The easement protects community agricultural use of the property. Chairman Ashford looked at Julian directly. This means you can operate an agricultural cooperative. But understand, we'll be watching. Any problems, any complaints, any indication you're running something inappropriate, and we'll find grounds for action. Understood, Julian said. We still need to vote, another board member said. The easement may be valid, but we can vote on whether to honor it or fight it. They returned to the main room. The crowd had grown restless, people talking in low voices. Derek still sat in the back, his expression dark. Chairman Ashford called for order. The board has reviewed the agricultural easement filed by the previous property owner. We've also heard compelling testimony about this farm's community impact. The question before us is whether to accept the easement as valid or initiate legal proceedings to challenge it. He looked at his fellow board members. We'll vote by show of hands. All in favor of accepting the easement and allowing continued agricultural cooperative operation of the property. Julian held his breath. Sandra Pierce's hand went up immediately. Then another board member, an older farmer named Chester Davis, who'd sat quietly through the proceedings. A third hand rose, a woman named Dorothy Hutchins, who taught at the community college. 3 votes. They needed one more. The fourth board member, a middle-aged businessman named Vincent Sharp, hesitated. His hand hovered near the table, uncertain. Julian could see the calculation in his eyes. Community pressure versus political considerations. Human need versus economic development. Finally, slowly, Sharp raised his hand. 4-1. The easement stood. The room erupted. People cheered, applauded, embraced each other. Beatrice pulled Julian into a fierce hug, tears streaming down her weathered face. June was crying too, and Faye, and even Iris, managed a trembling smile. Valeria grabbed her children, holding them close, while Sophia asked what happened and why everyone was so happy. Chairman Ashford banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! We need order!" The noise subsided gradually. Ashford's expression was sour, his voice clipped with barely contained irritation. The motion carries 4-1. The agricultural easement is accepted as valid. Mr. Graves's revitalization agreement will be modified to reflect cooperative agricultural use. The property will remain under his ownership subject to continued compliance with easement terms. He paused, looking directly at Julian. But understand this. Any violations, any problems, any indication this arrangement is being abused, and this board will take action. You're being given a chance. Don't squander it. We won't, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Patricia gathered her documents, satisfaction evident on her professional features. I'll file the necessary paperwork to formalize the cooperative structure. You'll need to maintain proper records, document all activities, and file annual reports with the county. We'll do whatever's required, Beatrice said. In the back of the room, Derek stood abruptly and stormed out, his face twisted with rage. The Midwest Agricultural Holdings representative followed more slowly, his expression neutral, but his body language suggesting defeat. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Julian and the women to offer congratulations. The pastor shook Julian's hand warmly. Local farmers promised to help with future planting. The elderly woman who testified about knowing Thornton embraced Beatrice and whispered something that made the younger woman smile through her tears. Outside in the parking lot, under the sodium lights and gathering darkness, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They'd won. Not just a legal victory, but recognition. Official acknowledgement that what they'd built mattered, that their community had value, that unconventional families deserved protection. I can't believe it worked, Valeria said, still holding her children. I was so sure we'd lose. We almost did, Patricia said. That fourth vote was close. But the testimony made the difference. You made them see you as human beings instead of policy problems. Julian looked at the women gathered around him. Beatrice, who'd shown him what steady courage looked like. June, who'd taught him about resilience. Faye, who demonstrated quiet strength. Valeria, who'd fought fear to protect her children. Iris, who'd survived impossible loss. They'd saved him as much as he'd saved them. We should celebrate, he said. Everyone back to the farm. I'll make coffee. We'll figure out what comes next. They caravaned back through the dark Iowa countryside, headlights cutting through the night. When they reached the property, Julian saw it with new eyes. Not just land he'd bought for $1, but a home they'd built together, now legally protected and recognized. Inside the farmhouse, they gathered around the kitchen table. Julian made coffee while Beatrice found cookies June had baked earlier. The children, tired from the long evening, curled up on the couch. The adults talked quietly, processing the victory and its implications. We'll need to formalize everything, Patricia said, pulling out her legal pad. Create bylaws, establish member responsibilities, document the cooperative structure properly. It'll take work, but it's doable. What about Derek? Valeria asked, the question everyone had been avoiding. He's not going to accept this. He'll find another way to cause problems. Let him try, Beatrice said firmly. We've got legal standing now. The farm is protected, and if he keeps harassing you, we document it and file for a restraining order. Julian remembered Derek's face as he'd stormed from the meeting, humiliated, enraged, dangerous. Men like that didn't accept defeat gracefully. We'll need to be careful, he said. Keep records of any contact, any threats. Make sure the property's secure. They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming. They discussed winter preparations, spring planting, expanding the vegetable operation. They suggested offering agricultural education programs for other struggling families. June proposed a community garden section where people could rent small plots. Around midnight, people began to leave. Valeria loaded her sleeping children into her van. Iris bundled her daughter in blankets for the short walk to the camper. Faye headed back to town, where Penelope was staying with her mother. Beatrice lingered on the porch with Julian after the others had gone. They stood in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge between drifting clouds. "Thornton would be proud," she said finally. "You honored what he started, made it stronger." "We all did," Julian said. "I just held the deed. You built the community. You could have sent us away that first day." "Most men would have." Beatrice turned to look at him. "You chose different. That matters." After she drove away, Julian walked through the dark farmhouse. June was already asleep in the downstairs bedroom, her breathing steady and peaceful. He climbed to his own room and sat on the bed, looking at the quilt hanging on the wall, squares of fabric telling stories of loss and survival. His phone buzzed. Another text from Wyatt. "Mom showed me the article about the hearing. Said you won." "That's really cool, Dad. Maybe I could visit sometime." Julian stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure he wasn't misinterpreting. Maybe I could visit sometime. Not a commitment, barely more than a thought, but more than he'd gotten in months. An opening, a possibility. He typed carefully, "I'd love that, buddy. Anytime you want. There's plenty of room, and I think you'd like it here. People I want you to meet." He sent the message and waited, hoping for a response. None came immediately, but that was okay. Seeds took time to sprout. Relationships took time to heal. He'd learned patience from working this land. Julian undressed and lay down, exhausted but unable to sleep. His mind replayed the hearing, the testimony, the vote, the moment when that 4th hand rose and everything changed. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the foreclosed business to the lost custody battle to the $1 farm purchase that had seemed like desperation but turned out to be salvation. Outside, wind moved through the fields with that familiar sound like whispered conversations. An owl called from the oak trees. The farmhouse settled around him, solid and real and full of the kind of peace that came not from isolation but from belonging. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Derek wouldn't disappear quietly. The cooperative would require work and vigilance. Winter was coming, bringing its own demands. But tonight, lying in this room with the quilt visible in the moonlight filtering through the window, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt at home. Not in the house, though that mattered. Not in Iowa, though he'd grown to love the land. But in himself. In the choice he'd made to fight for something bigger than his own comfort, to build community instead of walls, to honor Thornton's legacy by continuing it. He closed his eyes, and sleep came easily, deep and dreamless and restorative. 3 months later, the first snow fell on the farm. Julian stood at the kitchen window, watching fat flakes drift down, coating the fields in white silence. The farmhouse was warm, the wood stove crackling, the smell of June's bread filling the air. Outside, the barn stood solid and weather-tight, ready for winter. The chicken coop Luis had helped build housed 24 hens producing eggs they sold at the farmer's market. The gardens were put to bed, covered in mulch and straw. The cooperative was official now, papers filed and approved. They'd named it Thornton Community Farm, with Julian as primary resident and 5 member families sharing agricultural responsibilities. Patricia had helped them draft bylaws, establish work schedules, and create a fair system for sharing costs and proceeds. It wasn't perfect. Disagreements still arose, logistics got complicated, but it worked. A new sign stood at the property entrance, hand-carved by Julian, with wood from a fallen oak. Thornton Community Farm, open gates, open hearts. Below, in smaller letters, the names Julian Graves, Beatrice Walsh, June Hartwell, Faye Morrison, Valeria Reeves, Iris Chen. The sound of an engine pulled Julian from his thoughts. He recognized the vehicle immediately, Sharon's SUV. His heart jumped as he watched it navigate the snowy drive and park near the house. The passenger door opened, and Wyatt emerged, taller than Julian remembered, shoulders hunched against the cold. Julian opened the door, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Hey, buddy! Hey, Dad!" Wyatt climbed the porch steps, awkward in the way of 14-year-old boys, uncertain of their welcome. Sharon appeared behind him, her expression cautious. "I hope this is okay." Wyatt asked if he could spend Thanksgiving weekend here. "I figured—" She paused, choosing words carefully. "I figured it was time." "More than okay," Julian said, emotion tightening his throat. "Come in, both of you. It's freezing out here." Inside, June emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. Julian made introductions, and June welcomed them with her characteristic warmth. She poured coffee for Sharon, hot chocolate for Wyatt, and returned to her bread-making while chatting comfortably about the farm and the weather. Sharon accepted the coffee gratefully. "This is a nice place, Julian, really. The article didn't do it justice." "Thanks. It's been a lot of work." Julian glanced at Wyatt, who was looking around with cautious interest. "Want to see the barn? We've got chickens now, and there's a pretty good workshop set up." Wyatt shrugged with practiced teenage indifference, but Julian caught the flicker of genuine curiosity. "Sure, I guess." They bundled into coats and walked through the falling snow. Julian showed Wyatt the barn, the workshop where carpentry tools hung organized on pegboard walls, the chicken coop where hens murmured softly in their nesting boxes. He explained the farm's layout, pointing out where different families gardened, how they divided responsibilities, what they planned for spring. "So you really live here with all these people?" Wyatt asked. "Sort of. I live in the farmhouse with June. The others have their own spaces. Beatrice has a place in town but comes most days. Valeria's renting a house nearby with her kids. Iris is in the camper until we build her something better. We share the work and the land." "That's weird," Wyatt said, but not unkindly. "But kinda cool, I guess." They stood in the barn doorway, watching snow accumulate on the fields. Julian wanted to say so much. Apologies for the past, explanations for his failures, promises about the future. But he'd learned that words mattered less than presence. The time spent working side by side could heal what conversation couldn't. "I'm working on a bookshelf project," he said instead. "Could use a hand if you're interested." "Nothing fancy, but it's good practice." Wyatt considered this. "Yeah, okay. I remember some stuff from when I used to help at your shop." They spent the afternoon in the workshop, measuring and cutting wood, Julian teaching and Wyatt learning, with the focused attention of a young man discovering he actually cared. Sophia and Luis appeared later, drawn by the sound of work, and Julian introduced them. Soon all three children were helping, passing tools and asking questions. Valeria came to collect her kids for dinner and met Wyatt with friendly warmth. Then Beatrice arrived to discuss spring planting plans. Faye stopped by with Penelope, who'd baked cookies for the gathering. By early evening, the farmhouse was full of people, voices overlapping, children playing, the kitchen crowded with too many cooks preparing too much food. Sharon, who'd stayed to visit, looked around with something like wonder. "This is really something, Julian. This whole thing you've built." "We built it," Julian corrected. "I just provided the space." Dinner was chaotic and warm. Everyone squeezed around the expanded kitchen table. June said grace, thanking God for community and second chances, for open gates and open hearts. They ate and talked, passed bowls and shared stories, the children giggling at the far end while adults solved the world's problems at the near. Julian watched Wyatt across the table, seeing his son relax gradually, laugh at Louise's jokes, listen to Beatrice's stories about Thornton. He saw Sharon watching too, her expression thoughtful, perhaps understanding for the first time what her ex-husband had found here. After dinner, as people prepared to leave, Sharon pulled Julian aside. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "At the custody hearing, I said you couldn't provide stability. But this—" She gestured at the warm house, the friends gathering coats. "This is real stability. Not perfect, but real. I'm still figuring it out," Julian admitted. "We all are." Sharon glanced at Wyatt, who was saying goodbye to Sophia and Luis. "He could spend more time here if you want. Summer breaks, maybe. Give him a chance to see what you're building, be part of it." Julian felt hope swell in his chest, fragile but genuine. "I'd like that. Really like that." After everyone left, Julian and Wyatt sat on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching snow fall in the darkness. The farm was quiet, peaceful, beautiful in its winter stillness. "Dad?" Wyatt's voice was tentative. "I'm sorry about before. About being kind of a jerk after the business failed and everything. You weren't a jerk. You were a kid dealing with your parents' problems. That's on me and your mom, not you. Still, I could have—" Wyatt stopped, then started again. "This place is pretty great. What you're doing here, helping people and stuff. They helped me too," Julian said. "More than I helped them, probably." They sat in comfortable silence, father and son, the distance between them still there, but narrower now, bridgeable. Snow continued to fall, coating everything in clean white possibility. Inside, June was putting away dishes, humming an old hymn. The wood stove crackled. The farmhouse held the warmth of the evening like a promise kept. Julian thought about the journey that had brought him here. The business failure, the divorce, the custody loss, the desperate $1 purchase. He thought about that first day, finding women in his wheat field, the choice he'd faced between solitude and community. He thought about Thornton's journal, the old man's wisdom, that isolation wasn't peace, and that making room for people wasn't weakness, but strength. The land stretched around them, 80 acres of possibility. In spring, they'd plant again, wheat and vegetables and whatever else the community needed. They'd work together, build together, probably argue and definitely persevere. More families might join, the cooperative might grow. Nothing was certain except their commitment to keep trying. "You know what?" Wyatt said, breaking the silence. "I think I'd like to come back for Christmas, if that's okay." Julian felt tears prick his eyes, cold air making them burn. "That's more than okay, buddy. That's perfect." They sat until the cold drove them inside, where June had left hot chocolate warming on the stove. They drank it standing in the kitchen, talking about small things, school, carpentry, plans for tomorrow. And for the first time in longer than Julian could remember, the future didn't feel like something to fear or escape. It felt like something worth building toward, one day at a time, with open gates and open hearts.